Born in Germany.
Born in Germany.
And I left in May 1939 on a children's transport, or a Kindertransport, to England. And when my parents and I said goodbye to each other, my parents said to me, "We will see each other again very shortly." And I really believed that. Whether my parents believed that, I don't know.
Right.
But they were deported in October of 1940 and subsequently in the summer of 42 to Auschwitz, where they perished. And by sending me away on this Kindertransport, I think my parents literally gave me life a second time.
Were there other siblings?
No.
No.
I was such a bad child, my parents didn't want another one. No, they didn't say that.
No.
But I really was a bad child. I felt very early on in my life that it was quite unfair that my parents could punish me for things that I did that they didn't approve of. And they did a lot of things that I didn't approve of, and I wasn't supposed to punish them.
What did your dad do for a living?
He was part of the family business, which was started by my great-grandfather in 1858.
Oh my gosh. What was the business?
At that time, it was a dry good business and grocery store. And later on, it was only a dry good business.
Located where?
In the village of Kippenheim. That's Kippenheim, which is in the Black Forest, about 30 kilometers north of Freiburg.
Now, to give us a little background, what is it that your parents saw that was occurring that would trigger all of this?
Well, Hitler came to power in January of 1933, and I think my parents very quickly realized that there was no life or no future for Jews in Germany. And they desperately tried to leave and were willing to go anywhere, with the exception of one place. They were not willing to go to then Palestine, because they were ardent anti-Zionists. And I didn't understand what that Zionism or ardent Zionism is, but I made it my own because that's what my parents were.
Could they have gotten to Palestine?
I don't know whether there would have been a possibility, but they absolutely refused to go there. They did not want to take the land from another people, which it turned out to be.
Right. And how young were you by 39 on the kindergarten?
I was 14 when I left.
Did you know where you were going?
Yes, I knew that I was going to London, and I knew the name of the family, and I had the makeup of that family and an address. I didn't know the family, nor did my parents.
What was the process? How did that work?
Well, England apparently has a history of rescuing children. I understand during World War II there were some Belgian children who were in some kind of jeopardy, and they rescued them. And they had been talking not in Congress, in Parliament, about rescuing German Jewish children, or Austrian as well as later on the Czech Jewish children. But they were talking, and they never reached any decision. And then Crystal Night happened on November 10th, 1938. And one of the members of the Parliament said, "You know, we've talked and talked. We really got to do something if we want to rescue these children before they all perish." And so they talked late into the night on November 21st, 1938, and then reached a decision that England would take in 10,000 non-guaranteed children and an unlimited number of guaranteed children. And a guaranteed child was one for whom 50 pounds was deposited to later on use to repatriate that child. And I was one of the children with the guaranteed child.
Right.
And the family that I lived with, the first family, it was a foster family, probably fairly well-to-do, but I starved. They told me that I was starving in Germany and I need to increase my diet gradually, or my food intake gradually. And for the 10 weeks that I was there, my daily diet was, for breakfast, 1 piece of toast and a cup of tea. For lunch, 2 pieces of toast and a cup of tea, and 2 more pieces of toast and a cup of tea for dinner. And they ate regular meals.
Oh, gosh.
And so I was placed within the second family. They knew all about it, and they almost forced me to eat. I said, I can't eat anymore.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Did you want to leave, or was it your parents?
No, my parents didn't know anything about it. I never told them, even though
From Kippenheim.
Oh, from Kippenheim. It was a joint decision, and I don't know if I had said no, I won't go, what my parents would have done. But my parents put it in terms of, I was no longer able to go to school in Germany. They say, you'll be able to go to school, you'll learn a new language, you'll be in a big city. They painted this beautiful picture. And always the last sentence was, and we will be together again very soon. And I believed that.
Did they have any reason to explain the political situation, what was going on at age?
My parents tried to protect me as much as they could, but there were situations, like in school, where I had a math teacher who was an SS man, who, when he asked me questions, no matter what my answers were, whether they're right or wrong, would ridicule me in front of the children. He also always came to school, or most of the time, came to school and wearing his black SS uniform, knee-high black boots, and in his right boot he carried a revolver. And when he asked me questions, he would have his hand on the revolver, or a couple of times he actually pointed it at me. So, the school situation, plus some of the children, they were in the Hitler Youth and whatever, they learned there, they acted it out, so.
Were there other Jews in school?
Initially, when I started there were quite a number of Jewish children, but the number decreased because some of them were able to leave the country with their families.
So now you're in London, and you stayed there for how long?
Until July 26, 1945, okay, when I went back to Germany to work for the U.S. government, for the U.S. Civil Censorship Division. And we were censoring incoming and outgoing German mail. And
Did you know there was a job available?
Well, it was really purely accidental that I got this job. It was on a Saturday. I was supposed to meet somebody in London for lunch. And with my typical German background, I was early. And so I was walking up and down the street just to pass time. And I saw this notice on this building. They said, if you want to see the continent, and in England, the rest of Europe is the continent. If you want to come see the continent and do some interesting work, come upstairs and inquire. So I went upstairs and I inquired.
And you're 20 years old.
Right.
Had you been working, or were you
Yes.
still
Oh,
in
yeah.
school?
I'd been working since I was 16. I had to drop out of high school to go to work and support myself.
Okay. And what kind of work in London were you doing?
The first job, I was a companion to a 14-year-old girl. It was a live-in job. And then later on, I worked in a war factory.
Okay.
And
you were single?
right.
Okay.
And now I lost my trend of thought. What would
Just get a little.
Your work before
Oh,
you
how do I
upstairs.
get to, right. And so I filled out the forms, and I had to take some history tests. I never had German history in Germany. We studied Greek and Roman history. So I guessed, and I must have guessed right enough times. Or they were desperate to have people, I don't know. And I passed the physical, got all the shots, and they said, okay, you're ready to go, but now you need to get the signatures from your parents that they agree that you can go because you're not yet 21. And I explained the situation. And they said, well, then get your guardian's signature. And I said, I don't have any guardians. And they said, well, then you have to wait until you're 21. And I said, please, I want to go, please, please. And they said, okay, if you promise not to tell anyone that you're not 21, we'll let you go. And then I had a big party when I was 21 in Germany.
Were you going home to look for your parents?
No, I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to go there was to look for my parents. But I didn't really do that. I mean, the logical thing would have been to go to Kippenheim. And it took me 2 years before I went there. Because had I gone there earlier, I would have had to admit to myself, my parents didn't return. And so I had this, we play psychological games with ourselves. And so I was saying, well, I moved and the post office doesn't have all the addresses, and maybe they lost the address, and somehow we will meet again. And I really played this psychological game of denial until September of 1980. That's a long time. And in 1980, I went back to Europe to visit the various camps where my parents had been. And the last camp was Auschwitz, where they perished. And when I was there and stood on the spot where the selections were made, not that there was anything there to remind me of my parents, but that's when I finally admitted to myself, there's no way my parents or other family members survived.
How had you learned the path they had traveled? Had you gotten letters
Well,
from them?
right, until they were sent to Auschwitz, and of course they didn't know where they were being sent to. And they were in separate camps. Initially they were in the same camp in what was then Vichy, France. And then my father was sent to another camp, also in Vichy, France. My mother was sent to still another camp in Vichy, France. And then my father was deported on August 19th, 1942, and my mother on September 11th, 1942, to Auschwitz. And so until they were being deported to Auschwitz, they could correspond with me directly. They were allowed to write only one page per person per week. And they never ever told me of the horrendous conditions under which they lived. And my father wrote in his last letter, "Tomorrow I'm being deported to an unknown destination, and it may be a long time before you hear from me again." And my mother wrote essentially the same thing. And then I received another postcard from her, dated September 4th, 1942, in which she says, "I'm traveling to the east," and she's saying where she is, which is also the postmark of the card, which was not the camp where she was in. It was directly north of the camp where she was. And yet she's saying, "I'm traveling to the east, and it may be a long time before you hear from me." And she's actually saying a final goodbye to me. And I was saying, well, Kippenheim is in an easterly direction, and maybe that's where she's going. I didn't read where she said east. I substituted easterly, although it's plain, it says east. But, you know, I was in denial. And so I knew where they were up to then. And in 1981, a book came out, a compilation of the lists that the Nazis compiled for each transport from France. And that book was compiled by Sarge Klarsfeld. And I found my parents' names in there, and my uncle, my aunt, etc.
In 1942, when you were getting these letters, was the sense of concentration camps known to you?
No, it wasn't. And also, you know, like the first letter that I received from my parents, my father at the top has written the address of the camp, you know, how I can reach them. And he says, "As you will note, we have changed our address." He didn't say we've been deported.
Right.
And so I thought, well, they're out of Germany. Great.
Right.
Which, you know,
Now,
even though the address was Camp, meaning camp, you know, Camp de Gurs.
right. It's a coping strategy.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah, I think had I admitted to myself what the truth really was, I don't think I could have survived.
Right.
And I needed to survive because I needed to see my parents again.
and when you went back in 45 for the censorship job, where was that? Was that
In Munich. And we stayed nearby in Pullach, Pullach, which was the Bormann settlement.
Yeah.
Bormann, we never found to try in Nuremberg.
Was there when you went to Germany, here you are coming from London back to your home country after the war, what was the sense of the folks?
Good question. When the train stopped the first time somewhere in Germany, there were children on the platform begging for candy, chewing gum, cigarettes, etc. And some of the people on the train were just like I, refugees from Germany or Austria, who had been in England during the war, were now going back to Germany to work for the American government. And some of them gave these children whatever they had with them. And I became absolutely livid. How dare you give something to these Nazis? Some of these so-called Nazis were 5 years old, 10 years old. They weren't Nazis. And I wasn't aware until that moment how full of hatred I was against all Germans, even little kids. And that hatred was a part of me for way too long. And I didn't get rid of it until the spring of 1970. The United States was involved in the Vietnam War at that time, and I was, from the very beginning, against that war.
Mm-hmm.
And in the spring of 70, it became public knowledge for the first time here in the United States that as part of the Vietnam War, we had been carpet bombing Cambodia. And that generated all kinds of thoughts in my head, and I was saying, well, I picketed and I marched and I sent letters and telegrams to my congressional people and to the president, but nothing happened to me, nothing happened to my family. And then my thoughts traveled back to Germany, and I'm saying, if the German people had done during the war what I did during the Vietnam War here, they would have ended up probably in a concentration camp, might have lost their lives. And how can I condemn an entire people for not willing to risk their lives when I don't know that I would be willing to risk my life? Mm-hmm. And with that hatred went out the window. And now when I've been back to Germany many, many times since then, and I feel, to maybe use a word that the young people use, I feel I have a virtual home there. I don't really do. And so I think in some ways I'm very fortunate. I have two homes, a home in Germany, even though it's only virtual, and a home here. And I belong there, and I belong here in the United States. How many people can say that?
I know it's a very impressive psychological assembly of the pieces of a
But
life.
it took so long.
Yeah. Now, tell us about
That
how
what Ben said, it takes a long time. Yeah.
How did the path of life lead you from the Munich job to Nuremberg?
The job was very boring. I was reading other people's mail, and we were supposed to look for codes where people would say something, that would lead us to something, And if there were any codes, I never found it. Maybe the code was, Grandma's coming to visit next Sunday. Well, maybe she really is. And so I wanted to stay in Germany longer because I had not yet gone and really looked for my parents. But I did not want to continue doing this. And I knew that Nuremberg, somehow I'd heard that Nuremberg was looking to hire some people. And so I applied, and they hired me. They had to be absolutely desperate.
Well, you had the language skill.
That's the only thing I had, really.
Now this was the Americans,
The American government, right. This was still while the international trial was going on. But
So you arrived when in Nuremberg? That
in
was
July of 1946.
Okay. And stayed where?
Until March of 48.
Okay. And you said Berlin was part
Well,
of-
I spent most of my time actually in this document center in Dahlem, which is a suburb of Berlin, which was subterranean, way, way underground, and was.
Is this where the embassy is today?
I don't
LA?
I don't know where the embassy is.
It was the Grand LA
No,
or the Hitler LA, I guess it was?
No, it was like in a wooded area.
Okay.
And the Nazis had made a clearing there, and there were these little ticky-tacky houses that were not for occupation to be occupied. They were just shells to make it look like a little settlement or something.
Well, I think Judge Kahl lives there. Judge Hans-Peter Kahl, wasn't Ben talking about that?
Yeah.
No?
Ben-
He lived in one of these houses.
No, he lives in Dahlem.
In Dahlem.
I'm sure he
Yeah.
lives in one of the beautiful houses.
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Dahlem.
I lived in Dahlem too.
Yeah, Dahlem is beautiful.
Right.
I love Dahlem. I was there this summer.
Yeah.
Got my bearings.
And-
So your arrival in Nuremberg in July of 46 is during the international trial.
Right.
And you stayed at the Grand Hotel
Right.
and went to work in the courthouse?
In the courthouse. Right.
Okay. What was your work?
Well, my title was research analyst. What that meant, I was to look for the documentary evidence to be used by the prosecution.
Okay.
And so when, if I found a document in Berlin, where I really spent most of the time, that I thought was of significance, then I would write like a précis, sort of a summary of what's in there, and then send that together with a document to James McCaney, who was the lead prosecutor in the trial of the doctors who performed medical experiments. And then if he felt it was important, then he sent it to the translation division, and they would translate it verbatim.
So were you assigned to that case
Right
from the beginning?
Right.
Okay.
And I knew nothing about medical experiments. I didn't know that such things had taken place. And it was just horrendous, because it was described in great detail, not what happened to a person, but what, just an object. I mean, it was just awful. And then, later on, I also sat in on some of the sessions, during the trial sessions. And I remember Hertha Oberhäuser, she was the only woman on trial in the medical case. She was asked, when she was on the witness stand, why did you perform these experiments? And she said, well, they were just Polish women, and they were going to die anyway. And by the way, all of the people, except those who were executed, all of them after about 5 years, no matter whether they had life sentences or 20 years, they were all released. And she practiced as a pediatrician. And then I understand, and I just found that out about a year ago, in 1960, some of the women on whom she experimented, she was in the Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was a women's camp. But some of the women who survived put pressure on the German Medical Association to have her license revoked. And so her license was revoked in 1960. And she then took a job working in the kitchen of a hospital. I wonder what she did there. I don't think she's alive anymore. She couldn't be.
Couldn't be. Oh.
No, she'd be too old.
Did you observe sessions of the international trial?
Right, yes, I did.
Tell us about that.
Well, that's one situation that I want to describe where it was childish what I did. But there was a 10-minute or 15-minute recess called, and the defendants had to remain sitting in the dock. And so I went over and I stood in front of Goering, just separated by that little wooden barrier. And he started to squirm. I didn't say anything, but he started to squirm. And he didn't know, of course, that I speak German. And so he asked one of the defense counsels, who is this little one? And the defense counsel, and what does she want? And the defense counsel said, I don't know what she wants, but don't say anything, don't do anything. She's with the prosecution. And I thought to myself, if not too long before that, if I had found myself standing in front of Goering, I would have been the one to squirm. And now he's squirming. It was a silly little power play on my part.
But what drew you to do that? I mean, you got up out of your seat, obviously, and said, I'm going to do it, or was it just like a magnet?
No, I don't know if it was 10 minutes or 15-minute recess, and what about, all right, I'll just stand in front of him. Yeah.
What was your impression? You walk into the courtroom for the first time, and there you see the dock, and there is Hermann Goering and Rudolf Hess and Ribbentrop. What was your impression?
Well, being as young as I was always awed by, here's little Hedy from Kippenheim, and look where she is. It's just amazing, So I was always awestruck.
Do you remember court sessions? Were there witnesses testifying or attorneys arguing, or what kinds of things did you see?
Well, yes, all of what you just described I saw. But, I didn't know as much as I know today, so there was a lot of it that went above my head. But what I did, you had the earphones and you could turn into the language, different languages. So when German was spoken, I would listen to German, and when English was spoken, I would listen to the English, because I wanted to hear it in the original.
Okay.
But I remember, this was not in the international trial, but this was during the medical trial. And I don't remember which judge it was, and so it's good because I can't blame anybody that way. The judge seemed to be nodding off, he was sort of sitting there like that. And then something, I don't know, woke him up, and he blurted out, "What is a concentration camp?" And the witness on the stand, and I don't remember who the witness was either, but said, it was a resort place for Jews. Thank you. He went back to sleep. I was so shocked by that. I mean, and nobody corrected it. It was just, it's there, it should be somewhere in the records. Unless it was deleted.
When you were in a courtroom for the IMT, did you ever see Justice Jackson? Was he ever present there?
Yeah, he was there, yeah. I didn't know what a great figure he was at that time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, don't forget, I was 21, young, innocent, stupid.
You knew he was the top American?
Yeah, I knew he was the top American.
Okay. So he do you remember when in July you arrived in 46?
Probably the very end of July.
Okay, because that's about the time he's giving his summation.
I wasn't there for that.
Okay.
Me too. I'm running dry.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Were there other people who you got acquainted with among the lawyers or American personnel?
Of course, the lawyers on the case that I worked on, which was, excuse me, James McHaney and his assistant, Hedy, Alexander Hedy. And so I worked very closely with them. And Ben Ferencz, even though he wasn't on this case, Ben was there for everybody.
Okay.
And
So you knew him?
I knew him, I remembered him from there.
You knew him to see, you knew who he was, or he was,
Yeah, I knew
he was
who
a friend?
Well, a friend is probably exaggerated, but I knew who he was. And, you know, sometimes he came in and he talked to us in the, you know, when in Berlin, and I'm sorry, not in Berlin, in Nuremberg.
Yeah. Right. He seemed to be very gregarious, and he's...
Right.
Does the name Jack Robbins mean anything to you?
I've heard the name, but I don't know who that
He was
is.
part of that medical case. I'm not sure what role he had, but he was.
I don't know who that is. I've heard the name, but...
Back to the IMT, October. We're here because of September 30th
Right.
and October 1st, the judgment in Nuremberg. You were physically there at Nuremberg at the time. Did you have any sense of the buzz around that?
I was not, by that time I was already in Berlin.
Okay, so this would have been
Yeah.
46.
I think I came to Berlin in the latter part of August.
Okay. Do you remember the verdicts,
Right,
being in
yeah,
Berlin, that
right,
the verdicts had come
right.
down in Nuremberg?
Another thing that I also remember, and don't forget, I was low person on the totem pole, that we knew that Goering had the opportunity to commit suicide. The only thing we didn't know is whether he will do it. And
Tell us more. What do you mean by that he had the opportunity?
well, what the information that we were given at that time in Berlin is that his wife, Goering's wife, came to visit him, kissed him, and transferred the cyanide pill from her mouth to his mouth. And that he kept it in his cell, and we knew where he kept it, and allowed him to keep it there. And so when he committed suicide, you know, well, we permitted him to do that.
So that was the story among
Right.
your group.
Now, I was in Nuremberg in the courthouse last October, and I talked to a man who took me around, and he said, no, that's not the true story. There's another story, that an American working in Nuremberg gave Goering that cyanide pill. So,
There's several stories, not the least of one just came up was in Los Angeles. There was a guy in California.
Yeah.
It's
There are a lot. I think that's a mystery
Right.
we'll never solve.
and you know, I want to share a couple of anecdotes with you, and this was when I was in Nuremberg.
Sure.
Sometimes a member of the prosecution would go and sit in when the German Defense Council would interview either their own client or a witness. And so I was asked one time to do this. And it was the Defense Council was going to interview a witness who was on loan from the British. And normally the Defense Counsel would say, this is Hedy Wachenheimer, I was then, from the prosecution. But he didn't introduce me, and he also forgot a document that he needed to, and so he said, I'm just going to run back to my office, and I will be right back. And the witness, assuming that I'm a woman, that I'm a secretary, all women are secretaries, and so he said, you know that there's censorship here, and I have a letter here that needs to go out, but not through the censorship division. And so I'm going to give it to you, and you mail it far from the courthouse tonight when you leave, and you will be richly rewarded. And he wore a huge diamond ring, and he's pointing to that diamond ring. And then the defense counsel comes back, and he says, oh, I also forgot to introduce, this is Hedy Wachenheimer from the prosecution. And this man said, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it, and please give it back to me. And I said, no, it's okay, I will take care of it. And I gave it, to the proper person. And I don't know what was in it, I was never told, but I was told there was significant information in there. So, how often did this sort of thing go on? He could have given it to his defense counsel.
Right, sure.
Tell us, your name was Wachenheimer?
Wachenheimer, yes. Wachenheimer. Good German name.
Very good German name.
He's a good German speaker.
And then
too.
somewhere
Right, we spoke briefly before.
And there's a Mr. Epstein who...
Right, there was. He's no longer alive.
I'm sorry, okay.
Well, you had two anecdotes.
Oh, the other anecdote, I only heard about it, I wasn't part of it. Some of the lesser people, if they were on good behavior, they were allowed on weekends to go home and visit their family. And so this one man came back on Sunday evening at the appropriate time, and there was a GI who spoke no English, and this man spoke no German, and wouldn't allow him to go into the jail. And so he had to spend the night somewhere in Nuremberg, and the next morning he came with a receipt for wherever he stayed.
He was a prisoner.
He was, right.
Couldn't get back in.
We couldn't get back in the jail because of the language problem.
Right.
Yeah.
But he insisted on coming with him.
Right.
Did you keep in touch with any of folks you were the young the secretaries or the?
No,
research
the only
assistants?
person, and we lost touch with each other for many years, and we were roommates in Nuremberg and in Berlin. But a few years ago, because of a documentary that I'm in, that she saw, we reconnected. And she also worked as a research analyst, but on another case.
Right. Who's that?
Dorrit Flowers. Margen was her last name then, M-A-R-G-E-N.
Doris?
Dorrit, D-O-R-I-T.
M-A-R-G-E-N?
Right. And now her name is Flowers.
Okay. And where does she live?
In Massachusetts.
Okay. Do you remember what city?
No, but I
It's,
think I have it in my little address book here.
What else should we ask you about your Nuremberg experience?
Well,
What kind of social life was there?
you made your own social life.
Right.
I think the higher echelons had more organized activities. We the peons, we made our own. And so what I did, whenever I could, on weekends, I would go travel to someplace and see parts of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
When I had more time, like vacation, I remember I spent 2 weeks in Italy. Because I thought, I'll never ever have that opportunity again.
Sure.
And how would you travel?
By train.
By train, okay.
At that time, there was one time when I didn't travel by train. I was in Berlin, and I had a ticket for the opera in Paris. And we flew out on Friday evening on a C-47. That's a two-engine plane. And somewhere over the Russian zone, the pilot said one of the engines died, and everything on the plane has to be thrown out, and everybody has to bail out. And I said, I'm not going to bail out. I want to go down with the plane. They strapped the parachute on me and told me, count to 10, and when if the parachute doesn't open, then pull the ripcord. And the last thing that I remember, I reached back like this. I was going to hold on to the plane. Somebody pushed me out. I didn't want to go. And I passed out, so I don't know anything about it. And it was probably a very soft
You
landing.
didn't pull the chute.
No, it opened up, fortunately. I don't think I would have been there to pull it.
So
Some
what did you
people,
wait for?
unfortunately, landed in trees, and they were pretty scratched up and entangled with all the strings and stuff. And there was a Russian military area, a military compound nearby, and they apparently were aware of it. So they came and they took us to their compound. And I was incredibly thirsty. I must have been hyperventilating or something. And so I asked for water, and I got this big glass of what I thought was water, but it was vodka. And it came out of my nose and everywhere.
So what had you landed on?
Just in a field, So I was lucky, And somebody, patted me on my, said, wake up. And, oh, where am I? And so we
Obviously
stayed.
you didn't get to the opera.
No, and I don't even remember what I missed seeing.
Right. Tell us about the meal card for the Grand Hotel.
Okay, we were given, we ate at the Grand Hotel, and we were given a card, probably like a 3x5 card. And every time we ate a meal at the Grand Hotel, they punched a hole in it. And I still have the card with not all the holes are punched. And so I'm going back to Nuremberg next month, and so I'm going to take this card with me and go to the Grand Hotel and say, I want a meal. Here, punch a hole in it.
Good luck.
Good luck,
Yeah.
Jerry.
No, I know it's not going to happen.
So what fun.
Right. I was in Nuremberg last October, and I was in the Grand Hotel, which I didn't recognize. It's just a very, very fancy hotel now, and it wasn't then, because part of it was bombed at that time. It was bombed before, not while I was there. And
Who did you work for in Berlin, in Dahlem?
I'm still for the...
Oh, that was still, you didn't have a separate supervisor or anything?
No, still...
You were just there doing
Well, there was
digging.
one attorney, only one attorney who spoke German, the entire group. Schwenk, I think was his last name. S-C-H-W-E-N-K. Can't remember his first name. It'll come to me. And he was in Berlin with us.
Have you written anything about this?
I wrote my autobiography in 1999. It was published. And I mentioned, obviously, it's part of my Nuremberg experience.
What about records from the time? Were you a diary keeper? Did you write any letters?
No, but I have lots. Periodically, I went into the photograph room, and so I have photographs that were taken by the court photographers.
Okay.
And then I have one document. I don't know what these copies were called. They're black with white writing on it. I don't know what that
Sort of a
was.
reverse image.
Yeah, I don't know. They had
Negative
they had a
image.
name, but I can't remember what that name was. And that is a sworn affidavit given by Rudolf Höss, not Hess, but Rudolf Höss, who was the camp commander of Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm. This is the one that probably was April of 45?
No, it's March or April of 46.
46, excuse me, that's right.
Right.
Smith Brookhart
I'm sorry?
is the attorney. It's an interrogation affidavit.
Right.
The American attorney, I think, is Smith Brookhart. Does that
No,
ring a
I think
bell?
it's another name.
John Amon.
No.
Okay.
I have it at home, but I just don't remember.
Yeah.
It wasn't somebody that I know.
Right.
And I think that was taken 46, I think.
Mhm.
What about your own snapshots? Any
Well,
personal photos?
very, very few, and they're very, very bad. I had a bad camera and a bad photographer, bad combination. But I do have, you can barely see it, but the little ticky-tacky houses in Berlin over the document center. And I don't know whether you know this, but the document center was under the supervision of an American Army colonel by the name of Helms, Helms, who came to the United States in the 1920s. His brother was a high-ranking officer in the German army during the war. His card that, Ben talked about this card index that they had of everyone who applied, that card was missing.
Oh, dear.
I think
Okay.
I've seen in the Alliarten Museum in Dahlem, they have the two big wooden card indices, the big boxes,
The
with
big
all
boxes
the drawers.
with all the drawers, yeah. Yeah, and that card was missing. And Colonel Helms, I think his sympathy was more with the Nazis than it was with us. And most of us working there were Jewish, and so he really hated us. And he gave us a hard time. The electricity was controlled somewhere upstairs, and periodically the lights would go out and the ventilation system would go out. And so there we were, stuck. And the elevator didn't work either then. And so you couldn't go in and you couldn't come out.
Right. How deep in the ground are you?
I don't know how deep, but it was very, very deep in the ground. And so we complained to Nuremberg, and they said, well, we're the War Department, and this is the Army, and the War Department can't tell the Army what to do. So just do the best you can. So we brought candles. It wasn't romantic, but...
Gosh. How many people were there in Berlin working with you?
Well, probably about 10 or 12.
Have you ever gone back to Dahlem to try and find?
No, I've not gone. I've been to where I lived, the apartment complex near Uncle Tom's Hütte.
Okay.
You know,
Right. It's an U-Bahn stop, right?
an U-Bahn stop, and the apartment complex was right there. But I didn't have time to go back to where the document center is. But I'm going to be in Berlin in, I think, early November. So maybe I can make it this time. See, whenever I'm over there, my time is so scheduled that I don't.
Well, have you been to the museum there? The Allied
No.
Museum in Dahlem?
No.
On the Clay Alley.
On the Clay Alley.
There's a big museum, and if you can't find it on your own, and I think it may be hard to find based on what Ben was saying, they can probably direct you to it. Where it was.
Where it is.
It may be rebuilt.
I don't know.
This is great, Hedy. Thank you.
This is an extraordinary bonus. You were on my list, and here you come here.
Yeah, I'm on many lists.
Is there anything we can
I don't know if you know this, but there's something, and I don't mean to be vulgar, but there's something called the shit list. It stands for, I forgot what, it's an acronym, and I'm on that list. And the only complaint I have, they have a photograph that's not me. I think it may be Bella Abzug, but I'm not sure, but it's not me.
Whose shit list is this?
Anyone who is considered anti-Semitic. And I'm considered an anti-Semite and a self-hating Jew and a few other things. Why? Because I've gone to Palestine by now 4 times. So, if you criticize Israel, then you're anti-Semitic.
Okay.
And I criticize Israel for its policies and practices vis-a-vis the Palestinians.
Do you still regard yourself as a Jew?
Oh yeah, I'm Jewish.
Do you belong to a congregation or anything?
No. I'm not affiliated.
Not a joiner.
No.
Just curiosity.
I'm a doer.
I do it. That's good.
Just out of curiosity, did you meet your husband in Nuremberg?
No, I met him here in this country.
Children?
Yes.
Grandchildren?
Yes.
Wonderful.
This has been wonderful.
Hedy, thank you very much.
Well, I thank you.
Thank you
It's
very
a
much.
real bonus.
Yeah, well,
For us, we can't.
And I don't have to go to this wedding.
Yeah, blame it on some lawyers.
Right.